Ethan Lawson was a man of few words. He lived a quiet, structured life in the small suburban neighborhood of Crestwood. A software engineer by trade, he preferred the solitude of his modest home, avoiding unnecessary interactions with neighbors. While others in the neighborhood hosted weekend barbecues or exchanged pleasantries over white picket fences, Ethan kept to himself. One evening, while working on his laptop, Ethan noticed something odd. His internet had been running unusually slow for the past few days, but he hadn't thought much of it. A quick check of his router settings revealed an unfamiliar device connected to his network. The name Crestwood I01 stood out among his usual gadgets. His heart pounded slightly. Someone was piggybacking on his Wi-Fi, determined to lock out the intruder. Ethan stepped onto his porch with his tablet and began updating his Wi-Fi settings. He changed the password, rebooted the router, and double-checked the connected devices. As he stood outside, the glow of his screen reflecting off his glasses, he felt a pair of eyes watching him. Across the street, Margaret Holloway peered from her living room window, her brow furrowed. Margaret had lived in Crestwood for over a decade and prided herself on keeping the neighborhood safe. She didn't know much about Ethan, only that he rarely spoke and kept odd hours. Seeing him standing outside, tapping on his tablet with a concentrated look, set off alarm bells in her mind. Margaret had read articles about hackers infiltrating networks, stealing personal information, and even spying on unsuspecting victims. She was certain that Ethan's actions were suspicious. Why was he outside at this hour? Why did he seem so secretive? The thought spiraled in her mind until she convinced herself that something was terribly wrong. Without hesitation, she picked up her phone and dialed 911. 911. What's your emergency? Yes. Hi. I'm calling to report suspicious activity in my neighborhood. Margaret's voice was hushed, as if Ethan could hear her from across the street. What kind of suspicious activity? The dispatcher asked. There's a man outside his house, Ethan Lawson. He's always been a little strange, but now he's outside on his porch, messing with some kind of device. I think he might be hacking into something. Maybe someone's Wi-Fi or security cameras. I don't know. But it just doesn't feel right. The dispatcher remained professional. Is he acting aggressively or trying to break into a house? No. But he's up to something, Margaret insisted. I just have a bad feeling about this. We'll send officers to check it out. As Margaret hung up the phone, she folded her arms tightly. She told herself she had done the right thing. Better safe than sorry. Meanwhile, Ethan finished his adjustments and sighed in relief as the mysterious device disappeared from his network. He turned to go back inside, unaware that within minutes, flashing red and blue lights would be illuminating his front yard. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the windows of Ethan Lawson's house, casting eerie shadows across the front yard. Ethan, still unaware of what was happening, turned toward the sudden commotion. His stomach tightened as he saw two police officers step out of their patrol car, hands resting near their holsters. Sir? Can you step forward? Please. One of the officers called out. Ethan, confused but compliant, put down his tablet and raised his hands slightly. What's going on? He asked. The officer, whose name tag read Officer Ramirez, exchanged a glance with his partner. Officer Carter. We received a report about suspicious activity in this area. Can you tell us what you were doing outside just now? Ethan frowned. I was changing my Wi-Fi password. Someone's been using my network without permission, so I locked them out. From across the street? Margaret Holloway stood on her porch, arms folded tightly. She had been watching the entire time. Her suspicions still high. Check his device. She called out to the officers. He was messing with something. I bet he's hacking. Ramirez sighed but turned back to Ethan. Sir? Do you mind if we take a look at your tablet? Ethan hesitated for a brief moment. He knew he had nothing to hide. But the fact that he was being treated as a suspect made his blood boil. Still, resisting would only make things worse. Go ahead, he said, handing over the device. Carter took the tablet and examined the screen. It was still open to the router settings page. Looks like he was telling the truth, Carter muttered. But as he scrolled through the connected devices list, his expression changed. Wait. What's this? He turned the tablet so Ramirez could see. Among Ethan's known devices was an unfamiliar name, Crestwood I-01. The officers exchanged a look before Ramirez turned back to Ethan. Sir? Do you recognize this device? Ethan's stomach sank. No. That's the device I was locking out. It's been connected to my network for who knows how long. Margaret, who had moved closer, scoffed. See? He knows about it. He's probably the one who set it up. Ethan exhaled sharply, clenching his jaw. I just found out about it today. It's not mine. Carter narrowed his eyes. Then whose is it? Silence stretched between them. The air felt heavier now. Ramirez spoke next, his voice more serious. This changes things. If this device doesn't belong to you, then who's been using it? And more importantly, what have they been accessing? Ethan felt a cold wave of unease wash over him. He had assumed it was just some neighbor freeloading off his Wi-Fi. But what if it was more than that? What do you mean? Ethan asked, his voice quieter now. Carter's fingers danced across the tablet as he pulled up additional logs. His face darkened. This device. It's been accessing security camera feeds. Margaret's expression shifted from self-righteous suspicion to shock. Security cameras? What do you mean? Carter didn't take his eyes off the screen. Not just Ethan's? Either. Several different homes in the neighborhood. The realization hit Ethan like a brick. Someone had been watching them. And the real culprit was still out there. A heavy silence fell over the group as Officer Carter's words settled in. Margaret's initial suspicion of Ethan had completely vanished, replaced by sheer disbelief. Someone had been watching them, violating their privacy, and they had no idea for how long. Ethan took back his tablet, scrolling through the device logs with a growing sense of dread. His heart pounded as he realized that Crestwood I-01 had been connected to his network for months. Worse, it had been accessing live security camera feeds, not just his own, but also those of at least 5 other houses in the neighborhood. This is insane, Ethan muttered, his fingers gripping the tablet tightly. He turned to the officers. We need to find out who's behind this. Ramirez nodded, his expression grim. First, let's confirm which houses have been affected. Do you recognize these addresses? Ethan scanned the list of IP addresses tied to the breached cameras. He recognized them immediately. They belonged to some of his closest neighbors, houses along the street, including Margaret's. Margaret gasped as she saw her own address among the compromised locations. Her hands trembled as she backed away. This can't be happening. Are you saying someone's been watching me? Watching all of us? It looks that way, Carter said. He turned to Ethan. Can you tell if these feeds were recorded or just watched in real time? Ethan's stomach twisted at the thought. He quickly navigated through the router logs, searching for any stored data. I don't see any evidence of recordings, at least not saved on my network. But that doesn't mean they weren't being recorded somewhere else. Ramirez ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. This is bigger than just a Wi-Fi dispute. Someone's been running a surveillance operation right under our noses. Margaret hugged herself, visibly shaken. But who? And why? Ethan's mind raced. He had assumed it was some random hacker leeching off his internet. But now, this was calculated. Someone had set up the device intentionally. And they had been watching for a long time. We need to track the source, he said firmly. Whoever did this had to be close by. They needed a steady connection to my Wi-Fi, Carter agreed. We should trace where the signals were being sent. He turned to Margaret. You called this in because you thought Ethan was the suspicious one. Do you know of anyone else in the neighborhood who might have the technical know-how to pull something like this off? Margaret frowned, her face clouding with realization. She hesitated for a moment before whispering. There's only one person I can think of. Ethan and the officers exchanged glances. Who? Ramirez asked. Margaret swallowed hard before answering. My nephew. Brandon Holloway. The weight of her words hung in the air. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had been falsely accused tonight. But now, the real suspect might be closer than anyone had imagined. Ethan's pulse quickened as the weight of Margaret's revelation settled in. Her nephew? Brandon Holloway was the prime suspect. Officer Ramirez straightened. Where is Brandon now? Margaret hesitated before answering. He's inside my house. Upstairs in his room. Ethan exchanged a look with the officers. If Brandon was the one behind this, then he was likely aware that they were onto him. He could be deleting files, wiping devices, or even watching them at that very moment. We need to move now, Carter said, already stepping off Ethan's porch. If he's the one responsible, we can't give him time to destroy evidence. Margaret followed, her face pale as she led the way back to her house. As they approached, Ethan couldn't shake the eerie feeling that Brandon might be watching them through his own surveillance setup. The thought sent a chill down his spine. Once inside, Margaret called out, her voice shaky. Brandon, can you come down for a second? There was no response. Ramirez exchanged a glance with Carter before they ascended the stairs. Ethan and Margaret remained at the base of the staircase, tension thick in the air. The officers knocked firmly on Brandon's door. Brandon Holloway. This is the police. We need to speak with you. Silence. Then, a sudden, frantic rustling from inside the room. A chair scraping against the floor. Footsteps. He's doing something, Ethan whispered. Brandon. Open the door now. Ramirez ordered. Still nothing. Then came the unmistakable sound of rapid typing, fingers hammering against a keyboard. Damn it! Carter muttered. He's trying to wipe his system. With a swift motion, Ramirez reached for the doorknob, only to find it locked. Without hesitation, Carter stepped back and delivered a powerful kick near the handle. The door burst open. Inside, Brandon Holloway was hunched over his laptop, frantically deleting files. His eyes widened in panic as the officers stormed in. No! Stop, he yelled, lunging toward the power cable, attempting to yank it from the wall. Carter reached him first, grabbing his arm and pulling him away from the desk. Sit down. Now. Brandon struggled for a moment before slumping into his chair. His face pale. Ethan stepped inside, his eyes darting toward the laptop screen. The command prompt was open. Running a script to erase data. Shut it down. Ethan called out. Ramirez quickly pulled the laptop away and closed it, stopping whatever Brandon had been doing. But the damage was already evident. Several folders had been emptied. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, her hand covering her mouth. Brandon. What have you done? Brandon's breathing was ragged, his eyes darting between them all. It was just a joke, he muttered. Just a prank. A prank. Ethan snapped, stepping forward. You hacked into people's security cameras. You spied on your neighbors. You had access to their homes. Brandon shook his head frantically. I wasn't doing anything bad. I wanted to see if I could do it. That's all. I wasn't gonna use the footage for anything. Ramirez scoffed. That's not how the law works, kid. Unauthorized access to a network and illegal surveillance. You're in serious trouble. Margaret looked like she was about to faint. Brandon. Tell me you didn't. Brandon's shoulders slumped. I got bored. I started watching hacking videos online. I saw how easy it was to break into unsecured networks. I didn't think it was a big deal. Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Not a big deal. You invaded people's privacy. You invaded my home. Do you even understand what you've done? Brandon couldn't meet his eyes. Ramirez pulled out his handcuffs. Brandon Holloway. You're under arrest for unauthorized access to a private network and unlawful surveillance. You have the right to remain silent. As Ramirez continued reading Brandon his rights, Margaret's legs nearly gave out. She had accused Ethan of being a criminal, only to discover that her own nephew was the real threat. As Brandon was led downstairs in cuffs, he muttered under his breath, "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Ethan watched him go, still stunned by how quickly everything had unraveled. The real hacker had been in plain sight the whole time. Brandon Holloway sat in the back of the patrol car, wrists bound in cold steel, his face a mix of defiance and panic. Officer Ramirez slammed the door shut before turning to Margaret, who looked as if her entire world had collapsed around her. "Mom. We need to take him in for questioning," Ramirez said firmly. Margaret barely nodded, her gaze locked on the ground. I had no idea," she whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing calling the police. And now?" Ethan, standing nearby, crossed his arms. "Now you see how dangerous assumptions can be." His voice wasn't filled with anger, but with exhaustion. "You reported me without any proof, while the real hacker was living in your house the whole time." Margaret swallowed hard, looking up at him with watery eyes. "Ethan. I'm so sorry. I really thought," he shook his head. "You thought wrong." Carter, who had been reviewing Brandon's laptop, let out a heavy sigh. "It's bad. Even with the files he tried to delete. We found access logs for multiple security cameras, personal data from some of the neighborhood's smart home devices, and login credentials that don't belong to him." Margaret's hands trembled as she covered her mouth. "Oh my God." Brandon, from the back seat of the patrol car, suddenly shouted, "I wasn't gonna do anything with it. I just wanted to see if I could. That's all." Carter turned to face him. "That doesn't matter, kid. Unauthorized access alone is a crime. You violated people's privacy. This isn't some harmless experiment. Brandon's shoulders slumped, his earlier bravado fading fast. Margaret stepped closer to the car, her voice breaking. Brandon. Why? Why would you do something like this? Brandon stared at his knees. I don't know. He muttered. It was just fun at first. Seeing if I could break into Wi-Fi networks. Watching hacking videos online. But then I found out how easy it was to access cameras. It wasn't about hurting anyone, I just wanted to feel like I was good at something. Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You didn't think about the people you were watching. The people who trusted their homes were secure. Brandon's silence spoke volumes. Ramirez turned to Margaret. We're taking him in for questioning. He'll be facing multiple charges: unauthorized access to private networks, unlawful surveillance, and possibly even identity theft if we find stolen credentials. Margaret's face went pale. What's going to happen to him? That depends. Carter replied. If it's his first offense, he might get a plea deal. But with the evidence we have, he's definitely facing serious legal consequences. Margaret wiped at her tears, nodding weakly. As the officers prepared to leave, Ramirez turned back to Ethan. If you hadn't caught this, we might not have found out for months, or ever. You did the right thing by looking into it, Ethan sighed. I just wish it hadn't taken being falsely accused to get here. Ramirez nodded. Fair point. Margaret looked at Ethan once more, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to make this right. Ethan met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Do better. With that, the patrol car pulled away, taking Brandon to face the consequences of his actions. Ethan turned and walked back to his house, locking the door behind him. For the first time in weeks, his Wi-Fi was secure. But more importantly, the real threat had finally been exposed. The night air felt heavier as Ethan stood on his porch, watching the taillights of the police cruiser disappear into the distance. His mind was still reeling from everything that had just unfolded. He had started the evening simply wanting to change his Wi-Fi password. Now, he had uncovered a hidden surveillance operation running from inside the very neighborhood that had looked at him with suspicion. Margaret still stood across the street, arms wrapped around herself, looking completely drained. She had been so convinced that Ethan was the problem. But now she was grappling with the horrifying truth: her own nephew had been the real threat. Ethan sighed, stepping back toward his front door. He had no interest in dragging this conversation any further. The damage was done. But before he could turn the knob, Margaret spoke. Ethan. Please. Her voice was weak, filled with guilt. He stopped but didn't turn around. What? I know I can't take back what I did. But I need you to know that I truly regret it. She swallowed hard. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood. And instead, I accused the wrong person while ignoring what was happening under my own roof. Ethan finally turned to look at her. There was no anger left in his expression, just exhaustion. You were so quick to assume I was guilty without a shred of proof. Do you know how dangerous that is? Margaret's eyes glistened under the porch light. I do now. A tense silence stretched between them. Margaret hesitated, then continued. I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want to do better. If I had listened instead of judged, I might have seen the signs sooner. Ethan studied her for a moment before shaking his head. Next time, instead of assuming the worst, try talking to people. Try getting the facts first. He turned back toward his house, That's how you protect a neighborhood. Margaret nodded solemnly. I will. As Ethan stepped inside, closing the door behind him, he exhaled deeply. He wasn't sure if Margaret would truly change. But that was no longer his concern. All he could do was move forward, knowing that the real problem had been exposed. The next morning, the neighborhood was eerily quiet. News of Brandon's arrest had already spread, and people were shaken by the revelation. Some whispered about how a teenager could have been spying on them for months. Others debated whether they had been too quick to judge Ethan. Ethan, for his part, chose to stay out of it. He had already learned the biggest lesson of all: assumptions could be just as dangerous as the threats they were meant to prevent. He sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen. His internet connection was faster now, uninterrupted by unwanted devices. He reset his router, changed his security settings, and took a deep breath. The ordeal was over. And next time, he'd be ready before anyone could assume the worst. How do you feel about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback to improve even more. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our latest videos. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.